The coffee went cold before either of them touched it. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug like he was holding something that had already stopped mattering. He wore civilian clothes, a plain gray shirt, no rank, no insignia. Nothing to tell a stranger who he was. It didn't help, he looked like a general. The way a locked door looks like wood. The shape was right, the substance. Underneath was something else entirely. Elias sat across from him with 3 folders open and a pen behind each ear, and a 4th one clicking in his hand that he wasn't aware he was clicking. His notes filled every margin, English on one page, Keth script on the next. Is something in between on the third that looked like shorthand but was a private notation system he had built for himself at 22 because no existing system moved fast enough for his brain. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast that neither of them had eaten. "They'll listen," Elias said. He didn't look up from the folder. He said it the way a person says something they've been saying to themselves for weeks. Worn flat, the shine gone, but the belief still solid underneath like bone. Under skin. Marcus looked at him. "They won't. Then I'll make them." Marcus picked up his cold coffee, drank it. 28 years of field tense and command posts had simply removed the ability to care about temperature. His body had reclassified it the same way it had reclassified a lot of things, not gone, just filed somewhere that didn't interrupt work. Elias looked up. For a moment they were just 2 men in a kitchen close enough to the same face that strangers went quiet mid-sentence trying to work out what they were seeing. Same jaw, same dark eyes, same stillness that looked like patience, but was something heavier than patience. A decision made a long time ago about what the world would and would not see. "I need you to not do anything," Elias said. "I'm not doing anything. I need you to keep not doing anything. Whatever happens." Marcus set the mug down, parallel to the table edge, precise, the way he placed everything. "Elias, whatever happens." The words came out like a door closing. From the inside, quiet, final. Marcus didn't answer. He looked at the folders, the Keth script in the margins. He had all the words his brother had learned so that other people could stay afraid of nothing. Elias left with his folders under his arm. Marcus watched him go. The kitchen stayed quiet. The coffee stayed cold. Outside the window, the city moved the way cities always move. Indifferent, bright, completely unaware that 2 men had just said everything they would say to each other for a very long time. 6 weeks later, Elias arrived at Keth Prime adjacent station aboard a diplomatic transport that smelled of recycled air and something faintly metallic that no amount of filtering had ever fully fixed. The station was large enough to swallow a city and not notice. Its corridors were the color of deep water at night, lit from beneath by panels that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm, and his research said this was the Keth biological equivalent of background sound, something between music and breathing. He found it calming. He suspected that was not the intent. He was given a translator, a small gray device that fit behind the left ear. He was given a room, a sleeping surface, a sitting surface, a blank wall, nothing else, and he was told the high convocation would receive him in the morning. He was not given water. He sat in the room for 14 hours. He did not ask for Water, he opened his notes instead and worked through Keth's speech patterns, ones that didn't translate cleanly, because they weren't built on the same logic as human language. The Keth communicated in layers. What something meant on the surface was rarely what it meant underneath. He understood this. It was not so different from people. In the margin of the last page, in handwriting no one was ever meant to read, he wrote, Marcus would have already counted the exits. He put the pen down. He looked at the room. 3 exits, northeast corridor, unmonitored. After 200 station time, if his reading of their rotation schedule was right, he wrote that down too. He wasn't sure why. Morning came by station time. An escort of 2 Keth arrived, tall, segmented, their skin doing the slow color shift that meant formal register. They walked him through corridors that grew progressively wider and more lit, until he stepped into a chamber that was built for one purpose, to make whoever stood in the center of it understand exactly how small they were. It worked. The chamber was circular when the high convocation sat in a raised formation along the outer edge. 12 of them in deep red robes, the color of old authority. The first voice sat highest. His skin color was completely still. In Keth body language, Elias knew very still meant controlled. Whatever the first voice was feeling, he had decided you would not get to see it. Elias stood in the center. No chair, no table, no surface for his folders. His notes were useless, and his hands were just hands open at his sides. He began. He spoke in Keth, the formal register with the correct tonal layers. He felt the room shift slightly, not physically, just a change in the air. 12 beings adjusting their expectations upward, because they had not thought he would speak their language, and they had not thought he would speak it like that. Not perfectly, but honestly, when the way a person speaks a language they learn because they actually cared about who spoke it natively. He talked about the disputed corridors. He talked about the resource surveys. He talked about the territorial expansion. Careful never to say incursion, careful to say expansion, careful to frame it as a thing that had happened rather than a thing that had been deliberately done. Because his job was not to be right, his job was to find the door. For 40 minutes the only sound in the chamber was his voice and the low hum of translator notes. Then one of the 12 spoke, third voice, Arith. Lower in the formation, his robe a shade between red and the color of water at evening. His skin color was active, shifting slowly, which meant he was actually thinking, not performing the stillness that authority required. He asked about human resource sharing structures, whether the surplus models Elias had described actually functioned at the scale claimed, or whether they were political promises dressed up as logistics. It was a real question, technical, precise, from someone who had read the proposal and engaged with it as a real thing. Something in Elias' chest eased. Tightness that had been there for 3 years. The tightness of not knowing if there was anyone on the other side of the door. He answered fully with examples, with numbers. Arith asked a follow-up question. Elias answered that too, across the chamber. The first voice's color remained very still. The thing happened fast. That was the detail that stayed, not the act itself, but the speed of it, the complete absence of ceremony, no announcement, no formal charge, The guard simply stepped forward the way people step forward to complete a task that has already been decided somewhere else by someone who didn't think the room needed no in advance. Elias had time for one thought, not a useful thought, not a brave one, just 3 exits. The translation earpiece kept working. It was still warm against his ear, still doing its job with complete mechanical faithfulness, feeding him words in a language he had spent 3 years learning, because he had believed, truly believed, that learning someone's language was the first act of peace, that it was the thing that started the door opening. The earpiece told him the Keth guards were reciting a formal completion of duty phrase. It told him the weather on Keth Prime was expected to be clear for the next 4 cycles. It told him third voice Akrath had risen from his seat. The translation of the formal posture was something between objection and grief, but the first voice's color had gone flat white, the color of finality, of something already done, and no one was going to say anything into that color. The earpiece kept feeding him words. Earpiece did not know to stop. The broadcast array in the chamber was active. Elias knew this because he had read the technical specifications of Keth broadcast technology as part of his preparation. The way he had prepared everything, read everything, learned everything, because he had never once stopped believing that knowing more was the same as doing more. Good, the signal went out on the standard Keth frequency, the one that every civilization with a receiver was tuned to, because the Keth had announced 3 days prior that there would be a significant diplomatic development. Every species with a receiver got the same feed, humanity included. The earpiece kept feeding him words until the signal cut. The last thing it translated was a routine maintenance announcement about pressure adjustments in Corridor 7, the northeast corridor, the one that went unmonitored after 200 back on Earth, in 11 different time zones, in government offices and command centers and ordinary living rooms. People watch the broadcast on screens of different sizes and different quality, and with different levels of understanding of what exactly they were seeing. In a kitchen where the smell of burnt toast had never quite left, and a cold coffee mug had been sitting on the table for 6 weeks, growing a thin film across the top, the kind of film that means something has been waiting a long time. A notification arrived on a small screen by the window. No one was there to see it. Marcus was already at his desk on Titan Station, in the narrow space between the notification arriving and the first call coming in. The space where a man sits with a piece of paper that has redrawn the shape of everything, and the world has not caught up to the new shape yet. He sat in that space for 4 minutes. Then he picked up the paper, set it down parallel to the desk edge. He pressed the comm. Get me the last 90 days of Keth territorial movement. His voice was the same flat, low load-bearing register. Nothing in it that a person could point to and say, there, that's the moment. That's where it changed. But Yun Yi One, who had served under General Marcus Voss for 6 years and had never once been afraid of him, stood in the doorway with the notification still in his hand. He was afraid now, not of Marcus, of the thing that Marcus had become in 4 clears throat minutes alone with a piece of paper and a decision that the rest of the galaxy did not yet know had been made. The rest of the galaxy would find out. The notification came at 0340. Station time, which meant Yun Yi Won had been awake for 22 hours and had another 6 ahead of him before anything like sleep was possible. He read it on his screen. Read it again. Sat very still for a moment in the way of a person whose brain is doing something complicated and needs the body to stop moving while it works. Then he printed it on paper, old habit, from his training days. Some information you don't carry on a screen you might put down somewhere. Some information belongs in your hand. He walked to the general's office. The door was open, the way it was always open when Marcus was working late, which was most nights, which meant the door being open was not a signal of anything, except that Marcus Vaz was a man who did not close doors he didn't have to close. Yuan had worked out over 6 years that this was because closing a door takes half a second, and Marcus had long ago added up all the half seconds of his life and reallocated them to something else. He knocked on the frame anyway. Marcus looked up from the star charts on his desk. The charts were spread edge to edge, outer rim boundary maps, supply line overlays, the kind of documents that meant Marcus was working 3 problems ahead of wherever the current problem officially stood. His eyes moved to Yuan's face first, then to the paper in Yuan's hand. Something about the paper, the fact of it being paper, Marcus knew before Yuan said a word. Yuan crossed the room, put the notification on the desk, stepped back 2 paces, which was not a standard military distance. It was the distance a person puts between themselves and something they can feel radiating heat. Marcus picked up the paper. Read it once, set it down face up, parallel to the edge of the desk. He did not speak, however. The office was quiet, except for the low mechanical breath of the station's air system. Somewhere in the corridor outside, a night shift technician was walking past with boots that needed new soles. Sound came and went. Marcus looked at the notification on his desk. His face did nothing. Not the nothing of shock, not blank, not frozen. The nothing of a man who had run the calculations already, somewhere very fast and very deep, and arrived at the answer, and the answer had locked every exterior thing in place while the interior went to work. Yuan had served in 3 combat deployments before he came to serve under Marcus Vaz. He had seen men go cold under pressure, and men go loud, and men go somewhere else entirely in their eyes, some back room where the real decisions happen. He recognized the third one, and he had never seen it frighten him before. Marcus reached out and picked up the cold coffee mug from the corner of his desk, the one that had been there since before Elias left. He turned it in his hand, slow, even rotation, the way you might turn a stone you found interesting. Then he set it back down. He said, "Get me the last 90 days of Keth territorial movement," Yuan said. "Yes, sir." He left. He pulled the data. When he brought it back, Marcus was already standing at the wall display with his hands behind his back, and his weight settled in a way that meant he was going to be there for a long time and didn't need a chair to do it. The calls came in before 500. First, the Secretary General of the United Earth Assembly, then the Joint Chiefs, then the UEA Director of Diplomatic Affairs, who was sobbing audibly on the line, which was the most honest response anyone offered. Then 2 separate calls from representatives of the Vorka Collective, a neutral civilization who had watched the broadcast the same as everyone else who wanted it noted, formally on the record that they were deeply saddened and had absolutely no foreknowledge of the Keth actions. Yuan logged every call. The list grew to 14 by 800. Marcus took none of them. He stood at the wall display and studied Keth territorial data and did not take a single call. And Yuan, who was a practical man from a practical city who believed in process and chain of command and the right way to do things, did not once suggest that perhaps the general should pick up the line, because Yuan had seen Marcus's face when he read the notification, and he knew that whatever was happening inside that stillness, adding the Secretary General's voice to it, was not going to help the Secretary General. By the second day, Marcus had not slept. This was not unusual. Marcus had gone 4 days without sleep during the Kepler corridor campaign, the one that people in military history circles called the 16-hour war, except it had actually lasted 11 days, and the 16 hours referred only to the final push, the one Marcus had designed in a field tent with 2 broken ribs and a headache that he had medicated by drinking water and refusing to acknowledge it. Yuan knew this story because he had been there for it. Marcus ate at his desk. He mapped, he cross-referenced. He pulled intelligence files that were technically outside his operational clearance, and no one said anything, because no one was prepared to be the person who told Marcus Voss his access was restricted. Not this week. He pulled Elias' full diplomatic file. The 9 attempts at formal contact with the Keth Dominion, all rejected, ignored, or simply returned unopened. Elias' proposals, the resource-sharing frameworks, the corridor demilitarization models, the pages and pages and pages of work that represented 3 years of a man who was very good at his job, doing his job as well as it could possibly be done. Marcus read it all once carefully, the way he read military intelligence, not for feeling but for structure, for what was there and what wasn't, for what the documents revealed about the shape of the thing they were describing. And he read Elias' proposal, and he read the Keth's territorial movement, and then he sat at his desk for a long time with both sets of documents in front of him and his hands flat on the desk surface and his eyes moving between the two. Then he began to write. On the 5th day, Yuan was called into the office for a briefing. It lasted 40 minutes. Marcus stood at the display the whole time and never once looked at his notes, because there were no notes. The entire thing was in his head, structured and sequenced and complete. He talked about supply routes and logistical choke points and orbital approach vectors and 17 specific Keth infrastructure installations and why each one mattered and in what order and with what precision. He talked about warning windows, how long each target needed to be warned before a strike to guarantee civilian evacuation. He had calculated these individually, each one different, each one calibrated to the specific population density and exit route capacity of that installation. Yuan wrote as fast as he could, his handwriting normally small and precise, spread out across the page and lost its angles, not because the information was difficult, because he understood what he was hearing, because he was watching a man take 3 years of his brother's diplomatic proposals and translate them into a different language, the only Language that the Keth had ever demonstrated they were willing to hear. When Marcus stopped talking, the room was very quiet. Ewan looked at his notes. Then at Marcus. "Sir," he said, "how long is this going to take?" "I know what it's going to take. The assembly will want to be consulted." "Yes. Are you going to consult them?" Marcus looked at him. Ewan wrote something else on his pad. Something small in the margin. Later he would not remember exactly what it was. Only that writing it made him feel slightly better in the way that small, definite actions make people feel slightly better when the large, indefinite thing is too large to hold. "Get me Admiral Chen and General Park," Marcus said, "and get me the Keth. Standard broadcast frequency. Specifications." "The broadcast frequency, yes." Yun looked up. "That's the frequency they use for the, I know what it's for." Elias' last communication arrived via diplomatic pouch on the 6th day. It had been recovered from the station before the Keth purged the official records. It wasn't marked urgent. It wasn't marked anything. It was just a standard diplomatic packet held up by 3 weeks of routing delays and the ordinary bureaucratic slowness of objects moving through space. Yun brought it to Marcus personally. Inside was a folder of notes from Elias. Preparation period, the Keth speech. Patterns, the formal register. Breakdowns, a draft of his opening remarks. Ordinary work. The kind of thing that goes in the recycler after the mission is done. In the margin of the last page, in handwriting that was smaller and more cramped than the rest, the handwriting of a man writing something he hadn't planned to write, was a single line. 3 exits, any corridor unmonitored. After 200. And Marcus would have already used 2 of them. Marcus read it once. He folded the paper along a clean crease, put it in the left chest pocket of his uniform, pressed his hand flat against the pocket. For a moment, not a gesture of grief, not a gesture of anything that had a name. Just a man making sure something was where he put it. He did not take it out again. On the corner of his desk, the coffee mug was still sitting where it had been for 6 days. Thin film across the top. Something that had been waiting. Marcus picked it up, carried it to the recycler by the door, dropped it in, walked back to his desk. Notification was still there, face up. Parallel to the edge. Marcus picked it up too. Read it one last time, though he didn't need to read it. He had read it once and it had not moved since. He just looked at it in the way of a person who was about to put something down and needs one final moment with the weight of it in their hands. He folded it once, put it in the recycler with the mug. He sat down. And GT, clear his throat. And GT. He pulled up the Keth star maps on his display. The full territorial charts, every system, every installation, every supply route marked in the clean geometric lines of Keth cartography. And he began to read them the way Elias used to read briefing packets. Carefully, completely. Every word, every margin note, every small detail that other people skipped over because they didn't think the small details mattered. Elias had always said the small details were where the door was. Marcus read the maps until the station. Morning came. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. He was inside the problem now, all the way inside it, and the problem had a shape. And the shape had a solution, and the Solution was not what the Keth High Convocation sitting on their broadcast signal in their flat white certainty had. Any framework to anticipate, they had. Killed a man who believed in words, they did not know his brother believed in. Something older and more final. Not destruction, not rage, but the very simple and very devastating idea that every problem has a correct answer, and that finding it is just a matter of being willing to do the work. Marcus was willing to do the work. He always had been. Yunan arrived at 600 to find the maps. Still lit and Marcus still reading, and 2 cold cups of coffee on the desk that no one had touched. He picked one up. Drank it cold. He didn't say anything. Yunan had been doing this long enough to know when to be quiet and when a room was already full. He sat down at his station and opened his logs and began preparing the documents that would need to be prepared. Because that was his job, and his job was the thing he had. Outside the station's observation port, the stars sat where they had always sat, patient and indifferent and very, very far away. The Keth Dominion was out there, somewhere in that dark, settled in its certainty, reading its own silence as the end of the conversation. It was not the end of the conversation. Marcus turned the page. The first strike happened on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything in deep space. There were no Tuesdays out past the rim. There was just station time and ship time and the arbitrary numbers people imposed on darkness to keep themselves from losing track of who they were. But the people back on Earth noted they noted a lot of things in the weeks that followed because they needed somewhere to put their hands while the larger event was happening. And details were something to hold. The target was Resupply Station Keth 7, a logistics hub in the disputed corridor zone. Fuel reserves, maintenance equipment, automated cargo processing, no weapons, no military command staff. The installation's workforce was 312. Keth civilians in a rotation of 62. Military, logistics personnel. A warning went out 38 minutes before the strike precise window. Long enough for everyone to get out and short enough that no one could get military assets repositioned in time to matter. The warning was transmitted in Keth formal register, correct tonal layers. It said, evacuate. And GT snorts. And GT, you have 38 minutes. This is not a mistake. They evacuated all 374 personnel. The last ship cleared the station's perimeter with 4 minutes to spare. Then the station wasn't there anymore. The second strike followed 6 days later. Then the third, then a fourth and fifth. Inside the same week. 17 installations total across 3 months, each one a resupply hub, a fuel depot, a logistics processing center. Each one warned, each one emptied before the strike, each one chosen with a precision that the Keth Military Command, reviewing the pattern from their war tables, found deeply strange. When the strangeness was this, Marcus was not hitting things that hurt, he was hitting things that stopped. There is a difference between an army that wants to destroy you and an army that wants to make you unable to move. The first one comes for your population centers, your government, your command structure. The second one comes for your fuel, your supply chains, your ability to push your territorial boundary forward by 0.4 light years per cycle. The Keth territorial expansion, which had been moving with the slow mechanical Confidence of something that had never been interrupted stopped. Not because they were losing ships, not because their military was weakened, because they couldn't refuel what they had, couldn't resupply what was deployed, they couldn't sustain the slow outward pressure that had been the spine of their strategy for 30 years. They were a hand pushing against something that had simply stepped sideways. The hand was still a hand, it just had nothing to push against anymore. On the other side of a very large stretch of space, in a small office on a station belonging to the Sindathi hegemony, a civilization that had in recent years found it convenient to supply certain Keth infrastructure contracts without making this information particularly public. An analyst named Vesa Thornweave was having a bad month. She was an intelligence specialist, had been for 19 years. She had a reputation in the specific professional world where reputations of this kind existed by foreseeing patterns in data that other analysts missed, not because she was clever than them, though she was, but because she had a habit of asking a different question. Most analysts asked, "What does this data tell me?" Vesa asked, "What is this data trying to do?" She had pulled the strike pattern within 48 hours of the first hit, mapped it, then mapped it again. Because the first map looked wrong, too neat, too considered, and she wanted to check her own work, it was not wrong. She pulled Elias Voss's full diplomatic proposal, the one that Keth had rejected, without formal response 3 months before executing him. She read it in full, which was not standard procedure for a military strike analysis, but which she did anyway because Vesa Thornweave had never entirely trusted standard procedure. She read the proposal, she read the strike map, she put them side by side. The 17 installations Marcus had targeted were precisely, not approximately, not roughly, precisely the 17 infrastructure systems that Elias Voss had requested the Keth to militarize as a condition of the proposed treaty. The resource corridors Elias had asked them to share were the corridors Marcus was now clearing by removing the Keth's ability to operate within them. Marcus was not fighting a war, he was building the treaty, one ruined installation at a time, in the exact order and configuration Elias had proposed. He was constructing the outcome his brother had asked for in that chamber, not asking for it, not negotiating for it, making it the only remaining shape the situation could take. Now Vesa sat at her desk for a long time after she understood this, very still, in the way of a person whose stillness is not calm but concentration, the kind that happens when a brain is working very fast on something that has caught it completely off guard. She filed her analysis under maximum sensitivity classification. The final line read, "The human general is not making war, he is making an argument. I do not know who taught him this. Believe we should find out before we decide which side of it to be on." She sat back, looked at the ceiling of her office, which was the standard Sindathi administrative gray-green, and had nothing interesting on it, which was fine because she wasn't looking at it. She was thinking about the fact that her government had, for the last 4 years, already been supplying the Keth with infrastructure contracts quietly, in the way that governments do things they prefer not to be asked about directly. And she was thinking about the fact that she was going to have to write a second report, a different kind, the kind that goes to different people and has a Different kind of weight. She did not look forward to writing it. She wrote it anyway. That was who she was. On Titan Station, Marcus slept 4 hours a night, ate at his desk, spoke rarely. His command staff had developed over the weeks of the campaign a specific kind of awareness. Not fear exactly, not tension, but a heightened attentiveness. The kind that humans evolved for environments where missing a small signal meant missing something that mattered. They watched him the way you watch a river. And not because the river is threatening, because the river knows where it's going and you want to know before it arrives. When Marcus spoke, people acted within seconds, not from fear, from the recognition that he had already done the thinking, and the instruction was the last step of a process that was already complete, and the fastest way to stay useful was to move when he told you to move. You and manage the flow, calls, documents, intelligence updates, the steady administrative machinery of a military campaign running at a precise and controlled pace. He was good at it. He was good at it the way Marcus was good at strategy. Not by working harder than everyone else, but by understanding what the actual job was and not confusing it with the other jobs that presented themselves nearby, when the actual job was to keep Marcus's attention on the problem and everything else away from Marcus's attention. He did this without being asked. He had stopped needing to be asked to do most things months ago. Late on the 31st day of the campaign, Ewan brought 2 cups of coffee to the command room and found Marcus standing at the display wall with the Keith star maps lit in blue-white, his arms at his sides, his eyes moving slowly across the charts, the same maps, the 3rd night in a row. Ewan put 1 cup near Marcus's right hand, left it there, stepped back. He'd learned not to ask during the map reading. The first time he'd asked. 2 weeks into the campaign, tired and curious in the small hours, Marcus had looked at him with an expression that wasn't unfriendly, but that had clearly arrived from somewhere very far away, and had said nothing, and Ewan had understood that some things weren't going to be explained, and deciding whether to be bothered by that was his problem to solve, not Marcus's. He had decided not to be bothered by it. He picked up his own cup, drank it, stood in a corner of the room that was out of the light, and watched his general read a star map the way a person reads a letter from someone who is no longer here to explain what they meant. The maps had been Elia's territory, the disputed corridors, the resource systems, the 17 installations. Those were the things Elias had spent 3 years trying to talk about. Marcus had spent 3 months learning them from the other direction, from the inside, from the angle of a man who needed to understand every piece before he could put it back the way it was supposed to be. Ewan thought about saying this out loud. He decided against it. Some observations belonged to the person who made them, and nowhere else. He finished his coffee cold, put the cup down quietly. On the display wall, the Keth Dominion spread across 40 light-years in clean geometric lines, systems, stations, supply routes, all the infrastructure of a civilization that had decided other civilizations were problems to be managed and had built itself accordingly. 14 of the 17 installations were already gone, warned, evacuated, removed. 3 remained. Marcus raised one hand and touched the display. Not a tactical gesture, not pointing at A target, just a fingertip against the surface, against the light of a specific system, near the Keth territorial boundary. The system at the center of Elias. Proposed demilitarization zone. The system Elias had called in his proposal. The beginning of a possible shared future. Marcus lowered his hand. 3 left, he said, not to Ewan, not to anyone, just the fact of it spoken into the room. Ewan said nothing. Marcus turned away from the display, sat down, pulled a different set of documents, not maps this time, but the kind of dense legal framework text that made Ewan's eyes go blurry within 10 minutes of looking at it. He read it with the same complete attention he had given the maps. Ewan recognized the documents. After a moment, they were Elias' treaty proposal, not the summary, not the briefing version, the full draft. 73 pages of specific, carefully constructed framework that 3 years of work had built, and a single flat white decision had never bothered to read. Marcus read it the way he read everything, completely, without hurrying, without skipping to the conclusion, page by page, the way you read something when you intend to know it rather than just know about it. Outside the station, in the dark between stars, the 3 remaining installations sat unaware. Keth logistics crews going about their work, fuel cycling through conduits, cargo moving on automated tracks. The ordinary operation of a civilization that had 1 month ago been entirely confident that the period at the end of humanity's sentence had been written. When the period had turned out to be a comma, the next word was being prepared. Marcus turned the page. The Keth High Convocation requested a ceasefire on the 47th day. They sent the request through 3 separate channels. The standard Keth diplomatic frequency, a back-channel relay through a neutral Vorkai communications node, and a direct transmission addressed to the United Earth Assembly that carefully did not address Marcus Voss by name or rank. This last detail was noted by everyone who read it and commented on by no one, because everyone who read it understood what the omission meant. The Keth High Convocation had never, their recorded history, addressed military opponent directly. Doing so would mean classifying the opponent as an equal. They were not ready to do that. They were, however, ready to stop losing fuel depots. Ceasefire request asked for a 40-day pause in hostilities to allow formal diplomatic engagement to resume. It referenced in careful language the established protocols for intercivilizational conflict resolution. It was correctly formatted, procedurally exact, the work of a government that understood the mechanics of diplomacy, even when it had chosen for 30 years not to use them. Marcus read it, handed it to UN without a word. UN asked if there was a response. Marcus said, "Tell them we'll speak when the last 3 installations are addressed." Yuan said, "Sir, the assembly is going to tell them." Yuan told them. The assembly's response came in 4 hours later and took considerably longer than 4 hours to fully process, because it arrived in 7 separate messages from 5 different departments and contained 42 requests for consultation, 18 expressions of concern, and 1 strongly worded note from the Secretary General that Yuan read, summarized into a single sentence, and then did not read to Marcus because the single sentence was, "The Secretary General is unhappy," and Marcus already knew this. the ceasefire request was declined. The Keth tried a different approach on the 53rd day. They sent third voice Arith, not through official channels, not with the formal bureaucratic weight of a convocation decision, a direct personal transmission addressed him correctly, specifically Ash by rank and full name, to General Marcus Voss of the United Earth Assembly Armed Forces. It arrived at 2:30 station time. Yuan was awake. He was always awake at 2:30 now. He had stopped fighting this about 3 weeks into the campaign and started keeping a spare uniform at his station because there was no point going back to quarters if you were just going to come back in 4 hours. He flagged the transmission as priority, brought it to Marcus. Marcus read it. Arith had written in formal Keth, proper layers, proper register, with a human script translation appended below. The translation was technically accurate, but slightly flat the way machine translation always was, missing the weight of the layered meaning underneath. Marcus read both versions, the Keth first, then the translation, and then back to the Keth. Well, I asked your brother a question, Arith wrote. He answered it fully and without hesitation. He treated my question as though it deserved an answer, which no human envoy had done before him and no Keth voice had expected. I have thought about this often in the week since. I am writing to you because I believe he would have wanted someone to keep asking. I would like to ask you a question, if you will allow it. Marcus set the transmission down. He sat with it for a long time, long enough that Yuan, who was trying very hard to be neither present nor absent in the way he'd learned was most useful, quietly refilled both coffee cups and went back to his corner. Then Marcus picked up the response pad. He wrote 4 words in standard English script with no translation appended. He answered questions. I don't. He handed it back to Yuan. Yuan sent it. He did not ask if Marcus was sure. He had learned over the weeks of the campaign and the years before it that Marcus Voss was always sure. The question was never whether he was sure. The question was whether the sureness was the right shape for the situation. And that was a question Yuan had stopped being confident he could answer. On the 59th day, the galactic community began to rearrange itself. It did this the way galactic communities always rearrange themselves, quietly in small incremental steps that were each individually defensible and collectively amounted to everyone deciding which way the wind was blowing and turning to face it. The Sindathi hegemony, whose supply contracts with the Keth Dominion, had been detailed in Vesafar Thornweave's second report, the one that had leaked through back channels with the reliability of things that are meant to leak, reshuffled its diplomatic corps. 3 senior officials retired, 2 new ones appeared in their positions. Hegemony released a statement expressing its commitment to inner civilizational stability and its long-standing support for equitable resource frameworks. The statement did not mention the Keth. It did not mention humanity. It did not mention the word contracts or the word sorry. 3 smaller civilizations that had been in preliminary alliance discussions with the Keth Dominion discovered around the same period that their schedules were full, conflicting commitments, unfortunate timing, perhaps next cycle. And the Vorkai Collective, the civilization that had watched Elias die on a live broadcast and issued a condolence note the following morning. issued a second statement. This one was longer. This one used phrases like demonstrated restraint consistent with established norms of proportional response and readiness to facilitate constructive dialogue between parties. It noted that the Vorkai had maintained a position of principled neutrality throughout the current conflict, and that this neutrality had given them a clear view of the situation's development. It ended by expressing that the Vorkai stood ready to support a framework for lasting peace. This was diplomatic language for we would like to be friends with whoever is still standing. Marcus received the Vorkai communique at 1400 on the 61st day. He read it, then handed it to Yuan. File it, he said. Under what heading, sir? Marcus looked at the ceiling for a moment, not in thought. He had already thought in something more like the patience you have for things that are inevitable but still slightly tedious. Too late to matter. Too useful to ignore. Yuan wrote that on the File tab. Verbatim. He had stopped editorializing Marcus's words weeks ago. The 63rd day brought the 16th. Installation, same procedure. Warning. Issued specific window. Keth personnel evacuated, all 108 of them, including a maintenance crew that had been running an emergency repair and needed 6 extra minutes, and got them because Marcus had built 6 extra minutes into the window. Once the installation was gone, before local Cath command could respond with anything except traffic on channels that Marcus's team monitored and UN logged. The 16th strike, 1 remaining. Vesa 4, Thornwave was not sleeping. Well, this was not unusual for her. During active situations, she had a brain that treated problems like chew toys and found it difficult to put them down even in the dark hours when the office was empty and the displays were on standby and there was technically nothing to do. But the current situation was keeping her awake in a different way. Not because she couldn't solve the problem, because she had solved it. She had seen what Marcus was doing within the first 2 weeks. She had written it down. She had watched it unfold with a particular feeling of watching a proof you wrote correctly be demonstrated in practice. A feeling that was partly satisfaction and partly something much more uncomfortable that she had difficulty naming. What she could not stop thinking about in the dark of her quarters at 300 station time was the clause she hadn't been able to analyze. The warning transmissions. Marcus's team sent the warnings in Cath formal register, correct tonal layers, the kind of Cath that took serious study to produce correctly. Not just vocabulary, but the layered meaning structures, the communication architecture that took years to learn. She had pulled the linguistic analysis on the transmissions, walked and compared them to the linguistic analysis on Elias Voss's official communications from his 3 years as Earth's diplomatic envoy. Same register, same layering approach, same specific construction choices in the formal greeting structure. Marcus Voss had learned to speak to the Cath the way his brother had spoken to them, not to negotiate, not to ask, just in the warnings, in the part that said, "Get out, you have time, this is not a mistake." In that part he was speaking in the voice his brother had spent a career building. Vesifer was a person who believed in being precise about what things meant. She sat with this specific thing for several nights before she was precise enough about it. What it meant was Marcus Voss had not separated the war from the diplomacy. He had run them as a single operation. Every strike had been the military half of an argument, and every warning had been the diplomatic half. And the argument was the same argument Elias had made in that chamber, and the language was the same language. And the only difference was that this time no one could choose not to listen. She wrote this down. Third report, personal file, not official, just for herself, because she was a person who needed to write things down to understand them fully. She wrote, he finished his brother's sentence, he just used a different grammar. She reread it, she left it as it was. Late on the 71st night of the campaign, Ian found Marcus standing at the observation port in the empty briefing room next to the command center. Not the star maps this time, just the port, the actual physical port. I looking out at actual physical dark, at the stars sitting still in the distance, and the Keth territorial boundary somewhere out past where the eye could reach. Ian stood in the doorway. After a moment, Marcus said, he used to say there is always a next word. Ian said nothing. When a conversation went silent, when the other side stopped responding, he said silence was not a wall. He said it was just a word you hadn't found yet. The station breathed, somewhere deep in the infrastructure, something cycled and was quiet again. One installation left, Marcus said. Not to Ewan, not to anyone, just the fact of it, the weight of where they were in the shape of things. Ewan looked at his general's face in the dim light of the observation port and saw something there that he had not seen in 71 days of the campaign. Not grief, not exhaustion, but the specific expression of a man who is almost at the end of the very long walk and can see finally what he has been walking toward. He left Marcus at the port, got 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the corner, came back, put one on the table near the port where Marcus could reach it if he wanted it. He sat down in a chair in the corner. That was out of the light. He waited. That was his job. That had always been his job, and in 71 days of watching Marcus Voss work, he had come to understand that the job was not a small one, that the person who holds the space around a man who is carrying something enormous is carrying something enormous too, just of a different kind, and that both things needed to be carried to the end. He waited. Outside the port, the stars were where they had always been. The 17th installation was still there, not for much longer. The 17th installation was warned at 690-minute window, the longest one Marcus had given. There were 240 personnel on site, including a crew that had been running a deep maintenance cycle on the facilities lower levels and needed extra routing time to reach the emergency transport base. Marcus had known about the maintenance crew. He had built the 90 minutes around them. They all got out. Then it was gone. The Keth High Convocations response arrived 4 hours later. One line, no tonal layers, no formal register, just the flat practical Keth of a people who had run out of the other kind. We will discuss terms. Marcus read it, set it down parallel to the desk edge, looked at Yuan. Tell them we'll come to them, he said. Standard diplomatic transport, 3 days. Yuan sent it. The reply came back in 40 minutes. Agreed. He waited for Marcus to say something else. Marcus had already returned to the documents on his Desk, not star maps, not intelligence. Files, the treaty proposal. Elia's 73 pages, which Marcus had read completely at least 4 times over the course of the campaign, and which were now covered in small, precise margin notes in a handwriting that was not Elia's, but that had over the weeks developed a similar quality. Careful, complete, nothing wasted. Sir, Yuan said, the Assembly will want to send a diplomatic team. Standard procedure for surrender proceedings is. I know what standard procedure is. You're going yourself. It was not a question. Yuan had learned many weeks ago that asking Marcus Voss questions he already knew the answer to was a way of filling space that the silence was doing better. Get me transport, Marcus said. Yes, sir. Yuan paused. Do you want me with you? Marcus looked up. It was a brief look, the kind he gave when something surprised him slightly, not the emotion of surprise, but the mild recalibration of a man who had not expected a question and was now quickly assessing it. Yes, he said. Yuan nodded. He went to arrange the transport. How many he did not say. That he was glad or that it mattered to him or any of the things that were true, and that neither of them were going to say. He just went and did the next thing. That was how they worked. The Keth negotiation station was not Keth Prime adjacent. It was smaller, a secondary facility in the disputed corridor zone, chosen, Marcus suspected, because it was neutral ground in the sense that both sides had recently been doing things near it that neither preferred to do on their home territory. They docked at 1400 station time. Marcus and Yuan and 2 officers who were there for documentation and who both understood that their job was to be as quiet and present as furniture. The Keth met them at the docking bay. Not guards, protocol officers. Formality distinction that mattered. The protocol officers meant they were treating this as a diplomatic event. Marcus noted this without comment. They were walked through corridors that were different from the ones Elias had described in his briefing notes. Lower light, quieter. The slow, rhythmic pulsing of the panels was at a different frequency. Not the ambient calm of Keth Prime. Adjacent, but something slightly faster. An elevated register, the biological equivalent of a room that knows the meeting it's hosting matters. The negotiation chamber was smaller than Elias' execution chamber, rectangular. A table, 4 chairs on each side, no raised formation, no architecture of dominance. Either the Keth had built the room specifically for this function, or they had chosen it specifically because it didn't look like anywhere authority had previously sat. Then Marcus sat across from First Voice Drath Ven and 5 convocation members. He sat still in the way he always sat. Still, not performing it, not achieving it. Simply the absence of the thing that would require it. 3 of the Keth officials later separately described him as unreadable, in a way that was itself a kind of message, which was the closest any of them came to articulating what it felt like to be in a room with Marcus Voss at the end of a very long argument. At the far end of the table, third voice. Akrith sat in the last chair. He looked at Marcus from the moment he came in, not with hostility, with the specific attention of a person who had been thinking about someone for a long time and was now measuring the reality against the idea. The room was quiet. Avero spoke first. Formal register. Correct layering, way the Keth that meant you were treating something as deserving of care. He said your brother believed we were capable of more. Marcus looked at him, a long level look. He was right, Marcus said, a pause. The room held it, that's why we're at this table instead of a debris field. The terms took 4 hours to formalize. Marcus did not negotiate them, he presented them. There is a distinction. Negotiation implies the possibility of adjustment, and the terms Marcus presented were not adjustable in the way that the room's current geometry was not adjustable. They were the terms because they were. The terms and the shape of the last 3 months had made them the only remaining terms, and the Keth high convocation. In working through the formal process, with the practical exhaustion of people who have been outmaneuvered by the same argument 17 times, signed where they were asked to sign. Demilitarization of the 17 corridor systems. Elia's first ask. Resource sharing framework for the disputed zone. Elia's second ask. A war crimes tribunal for the execution to be composed exclusively of Keth judiciary. Marcus had not asked for human involvement in this. He had asked only that it happen and that clears throat the record be complete, and that the Keth do it themselves, because a justice that comes from outside is a performance, and a justice that comes from inside is a reckoning, and Marcus wanted a reckoning. And one clause that was not in Elia's proposal, that existed in no draft, no preliminary document, no record anywhere, written in Marcus's hand on the back of a transmission printout sometime around 300 on a night that Ewan had not been awake to witness. The Keth secretary read it out loud as part of the formal record. The translator node rendered it in flat, accurate, toneless Keth. The Keth Dominion acknowledges that the United Earth Assembly requested formal dialogue on 9 separate occasions prior to the commencement of hostilities. The record will reflect that humanity asked first. No one argued the clause, not because they agreed with it, though Acraz's color shift suggested he might have, because they were not at this point in the proceedings in a position to argue anything, and they knew it, and Marcus knew they knew it, and none of this needed to be said. The pen moved across the paper. The room was quiet. Marcus reached into the left breast pocket of his uniform. He had reached into that pocket hundreds of times over the past 3 months, checking, confirming the small, unconscious gesture of making sure something was still where he put it. He had never taken it out. He took it out now. Elia's translation earpiece, small, gray, ordinary looking. The kind of device that came in a standard diplomatic kit and was not particularly remarkable except for the specific way it had continued doing its job with complete mechanical faithfulness after everything else stopped. He set it on the table in the center, between himself and the first voice. He did not look at it. He did not explain it. He did not look at Arith, though Arith was looking at it with the expression of a man who had read enough human briefing documents to understand exactly what he was seeing. Marcus had already stood. Ewan gathered the documents. The 2 officers gathered their things. The protocol formalities were completed. With the appropriate language, they walked back to the docking bay. Marcus did not look back. The treaty terms went out on the Keth standard broadcast frequency, the same one they had used for the execution. Every civilization with a receiver got The same feed, the same way they had gotten the same feed 3 months ago when the Keth had used the frequency to send a message about what humanity's sentence looked like with a period at the end. This time they read the terms: corridor demilitarization, the resource framework, the tribunal, clause 1 of the handwritten edition, about 9 requests for dialogue in offices and command centers and ordinary rooms across 40 light years. People read the broadcast and made decisions about what it meant. On the Sindathi hegemony station, Vesa 4 Thornway read the terms at her desk. She read them twice. She read the handwritten clause 3 times. She opened her personal log, not an official report, not an analysis document with a classification level. Just the log she kept because she was a person who had always believed that some things needed to be written down simply to be true in the way they deserved to be true. She wrote, humanity sent a man who believed in words. Then they sent a man who knew what words cost. The frightening part, the part I will be thinking about for a long time, is that they were making the same argument they always intended to build. The table, they just needed someone to teach the rest of us what the table was worth. She read it back, she left it, she closed the log, opened her official file, began writing the 3rd report, the one that her government had been waiting for, the one about what posture the Sindathi hegemony should adopt in the current post-conflict period. She wrote it carefully, honestly. She named the supply contracts, she named the failures, she named the correction that was required. It was not a comfortable report. It would not make her popular in certain offices. She filed it anyway. That was who she was. The ship carrying Marcus and Ulan back to Earth had a standard transit time of 11 days, which meant 11 days of operational standby. Not the pause of peace, but the different quality of quiet that comes when the active work is done and the machinery of aftermath has not fully started yet. Ulan dealt with the correspondence. There was a great deal of it. The Secretary General, the Joint Chiefs, the Vorcha Collective, who had sent 3 separate messages now, each warmer than the last, as though warmth applied in sufficient quantity would retroactively rewrite the condolence note. Several alien diplomats whose civilizations had not been involved in the conflict but who had been watching with the focused attention of people taking notes for future reference. He dealt with all of it. He kept Marcus's space clear the way he had kept it clear for 3 months, and he felt in a way he had not expected to feel that the 11 days of transit were something he needed as much as Marcus did, a threshold, a space between what had been happening and whatever came next. On the 4th day of transit, he brought 2 cups of coffee to the small common area adjacent to the command space and found Marcus sitting at the table with the Keth star maps in front of him. Same maps. Ulan sat down across from him. He put a cup near Marcus's right hand, wrapped both his own hands around his cup. He looked at the maps. He looked at Marcus. What are you looking for? He asked. He said it the way you say something you have been not saying for a long time. Not demanding, just finally. Marcus looked at the maps for a moment longer, slowly folded them once along a clean crease, set them aside. Nothing, he said. Ulan waited, found it. Yuan drank his coffee. It was cold. He had long since stopped noticing. Outside the ship's hull, the stars sat in their fixed positions, patient and immovable, the way they had been sitting while Elias had learned their language and while Marcus had learned their distances, the way they would be sitting long after both of those things were over. Marcus did not reach for his coffee. He looked at the stars through the port. He was quiet for a long time, not the working quiet of the campaign, the dense, directed quiet of a man three problems ahead of the situation, just quiet, the different kind, and the kind you are when you have been going somewhere for a very long time and you have finally arrived, and the arriving is more complicated than the going was, in the way that arriving always is. Yuan didn't speak. He had learned everything there was to learn about when not to speak. On the 8th night Marcus slept 8 hours uninterrupted. His body did it as though it had been waiting, patient and certain for the moment when the work was done enough to allow it. Yuan checked on him once, left him, went back to his station in the correspondence in the long administrative work of the aftermath, which was not glamorous work, but which was necessary work, and which he did with the same care he had given everything else. Well, because that was who he was, and because Marcus had built something and someone needed to help hold it up while the ground settled around it. 3 days out from Earth, Yuan filed the last major report, closed the active campaign logs, prepared the formal documentation that would go to the Assembly, the Joint Chiefs, the historical record. He paused at the classification fields, looked at the blank line for the campaign's operational name. He thought about it for a long moment. He typed Elias. He submitted it. He made 2 cups of coffee, left one by Marcus's station, went back to work.